Arizona Territory, 1875. The unforgiving summer sun beat down on the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, a frontier town where fortunes were made in cattle and lost in cards. The air hummed with tension as settlers pushed further into Apache territory, each side regarding the other with suspicion born of blood and broken promises. This was no place for tenderness, a truth 25-year-old Yates Young had long ago etched into his heart alongside the memory of too many graves. Yates dismounted his dun-colored gelding outside the general store, his lean frame casting a long shadow across the weathered boardwalk. His face, handsome despite the weathering of outdoor life, maintained the smooth features of youth save for a light stubble that had accumulated during the three-day cattle drive. Blue eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the street with the habitual wariness of a man who'd learned early that the frontier rewarded vigilance and punished distraction. Another successful drive, Young called Samuel Thornton, the store owner, as Yates approached. Successful enough, Yates replied, removing his dust-covered hat and running a hand through his sun-lightened brown hair. The Double Cross Ranch will see another season. What he didn't say was how empty that victory felt. At 25, he'd built a respectable spread 10 miles outside of town, with 40 head of cattle and prospects for more. He had what other men dreamed of: independence, respect, a future. Yet each night he returned to a cabin haunted not by spirits but by silence. Not that it mattered. Yates had buried his parents and two sisters to frontier fever when he was 17. Love was a luxury that got people killed out west. Better to be self-sufficient, to need no one. The ranch was enough, it had to be. "Got a letter for you," Thornton said, disappearing briefly into the store and returning with an envelope. "Ryder brought it from Tucson 2 days ago." Yates accepted the letter, noting the familiar handwriting of his former trail boss, now ranching in Texas. Pocketing it for later, he proceeded with his errands, supplies, ammunition, the practical necessities of frontier life. His mind already calculating winter provisions, he failed to notice the commotion until it erupted directly in his path. Thieving savage, a burly man with a whiskey-soaked beard, shoved a young woman against the hitching post. "I saw you eyeing my saddlebags." Yates' hand instinctively moved toward his revolver, but he hesitated upon seeing the woman. She was clearly Apache, perhaps 20 years old, with raven-black hair falling in a long braid down her back. Unlike many of her people who had been forced onto reservations, she wore a curious blend of traditional dress and settler clothing, a calico blouse over a doeskin skirt adorned with intricate beadwork. "I did not touch your things," she responded in perfect English, her chin raised defiantly despite the man's threatening stance. "I was passing by." "Likely story," the man seized her arm roughly. "Time someone taught your kind about respect." Something in her dignified resistance struck Yates like a physical blow. Before he could consider the wisdom of intervention, he stepped forward. "That's enough," he said, voice low but carrying the quiet authority that made his ranch hands listen. "Let her go." The man turned, surprise quickly hardening to hostility. "This ain't your concern, Young. This Apache was sneaking around where she doesn't belong." "I see a woman being accosted in broad daylight," Yates countered evenly, "and I don't see evidence of any theft." A crowd had begun to gather, the town's usual midday lethargy giving way to the prospect of confrontation. Yates was acutely aware of the delicate position, respected rancher versus the town's prevailing sentiment about indigenous people. "Why defend a savage?" the man growled, but his grip loosened slightly. The woman used the momentary distraction to pull free, stepping back with grace that belied her precarious situation. Her eyes met Yates's, dark as midnight, intelligent, and filled with a fire that startled him. "I need no defender," she stated clearly, addressing Yates while keeping her accuser in sight, "but I thank you for speaking truth." Something about her composure, her refusal to be diminished even when outnumbered, resonated with Yates. It wasn't just courage, it was dignity. Sheriff Mills finally pushed through the onlookers. "What's the trouble here?" After statements were taken and the crowd dispersed, with the accuser slinking away when no evidence of wrongdoing could be produced, Yates found himself alone with the young woman outside the general store. "I meant what I said," she told him. "I do not need saving, but fairness is rare enough to acknowledge." "Yates Young," he offered, extending his hand after a moment's hesitation. She regarded his hand briefly before taking it. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused from work. "Bright Path is my name, though at the mission school they called me Bianca." A sardonic smile briefly touched her lips. "Bianca Pathfinder is what is written in their books." "Which do you prefer?" The question seemed to surprise her. Bright Path is who I am, Bianca is who they wish me to be. She studied him openly, assessing, you are the rancher from the valley. The one who does not shoot at my people when they pass through the North Ridge. Yates shifted uncomfortably. It was true, unlike many settlers, he had maintained an uneasy peace with the local Apache, allowing them passage across a corner of his property that had traditionally been part of their hunting grounds. No point in making enemies unnecessarily, he said, downplaying what had been a deliberate choice. Bright Path nodded. Wisdom is also rare. She gathered a small pack she'd set aside. I must return. My grandmother awaits her medicine. Medicine? Is someone ill? My grandmother is the healer. I gather plants for her. She hesitated. The best juniper grows on your North Ridge. Understanding dawned. You've been collecting on my land. The earth belongs to no man, she replied, then added with the ghost of a smile, but yes, I have walked there. The plants have been good this season. An idea formed in Yates' mind, one that surprised him with its immediacy. I'm heading back to my ranch now. I could take you as far as the ridge. Bright Path regarded him with open suspicion. Why would you do this? It's on my way, he said, which was true enough, and it seems safer than walking, given today's events. She considered his offer with calculating eyes. I accept. But I ride my own horse. Only then did Yates notice the small pinto tethered at the far end of the street, deliberately apart from the settlers' mounts. It spoke volumes about the daily negotiations of her existence. As they rode out of town, Yates became uncomfortably aware of the stares following them. He just committed a significant breach of frontier social code, treating an Apache woman as an equal, offering assistance publicly. It shouldn't matter. He kept to himself anyway, yet as they traveled the dusty road toward the valley, something in the silence between them felt not awkward but companionable. Bright Path rode well, sitting her horse with the natural ease of someone who had grown up in the saddle. She matched his pace without effort, her posture proud but relaxed. Why did you intervene? She asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Most white men in that town would have joined in the accusation. Yates considered the question. My father taught me to judge people by their actions, not where they came from. A rare teaching among your kind. He wasn't always popular for it, Yates admitted, memories surfacing of tense confrontations and neighbors' suspicions. But he believed in fairness. And you? Her gaze was direct, challenging. Do you believe in fairness, or do you simply honor your father's memory? The question struck uncomfortably close to truths Yates rarely examined. Both, I suppose. They rode in silence until reaching a fork in the trail. To the right lay the main path to his ranch. To the left, the route curved toward the North Ridge where juniper grew thick among the rocks. I can continue alone from here, Bright Path said, reining in her pinto. I'll ride with you to the ridge, Yates found himself saying. It's been a while since I checked that section of my property. She gave him a look that said she understood his pretense but nodded. As you wish. The trail narrowed as they climbed, forcing them to ride single file. Yates found his attention divided between scanning for potential dangers and observing his companion. There was an economy to her movements, a self-contained confidence unlike the frontier women he knew who often wore their hardships visibly. At the crest of the ridge, Bright Path dismounted in a fluid motion and secured her horse to a scrub oak. The junipers I seek are in that direction, she pointed toward a rocky outcropping. I will not be long. I'll come with you, Yates said, surprising himself again. At her questioning look, he added lamely, I should know which plants are valuable on my land. A smile flickered across her face, the first genuine one he'd seen. Very practical rancher young. For the next hour, Yates received an education in medicinal plants. Bright Path moved through the landscape with intimate knowledge, showing him plants he'd trampled underfoot for years without recognizing their value. Her hands were deft as she harvested, taking only what she needed, often leaving offerings of cornmeal in return. My grandmother says we must always give back when we take, she explained, sprinkling cornmeal at the base of a juniper. Balance must be maintained. Your grandmother sounds wise. She is the keeper of our ways, Bright Path said, a note of pride evident. When the soldiers came and many were taken to the reservation, she led our small band into the high mountains. We have remained free, though it grows harder each season. Yates absorbed this information carefully. He had heard rumors of small groups of Apache still living independently in the most inaccessible parts of the territory, but direct acknowledgement of such existence was a significant trust. "How do you manage to come into town?" he asked. "Surely it's dangerous." "I was educated at the mission school before my escape," she answered, her voice carefully neutral. "I can pass as civilized when necessary. I trade medicines and sometimes act as translator when there are difficulties between our peoples." The complexity of her existence, bridging two worlds while belonging fully to neither, struck Yates forcefully. His own isolation was largely self-imposed, hers was thrust upon her by circumstances and history. As they finished gathering plants and prepared to depart, dark clouds began gathering over the western mountains. "A storm comes," Bright Path observed, glancing at the sky with concern. "Earlier than expected." Yates followed her gaze, recognizing the signs of a sudden summer thunderstorm. "It'll hit within the hour and hard." "My ranch is closer than your return journey. You could wait it out there." The offer hung between them, laden with implications neither fully articulated. An Apache woman entering a white man's home invited speculation and danger for both. "Your neighbors would not approve," she noted. "No neighbors for 5 miles," Yates replied, "and their approval isn't something I seek." After a moment's deliberation, Bright Path nodded. "I accept. My grandmother will understand when I am delayed by weather." They rode swiftly as the sky darkened, reaching Yates' modest ranch just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. The main house was a substantial cabin with a newer addition, built by Yates himself over the past few years. A barn, corral, and bunkhouse for the 2 hands he employed during busy seasons completed the small compound. "Your men?" Bright Path asked as they stabled the horses. "In town until tomorrow. I gave them time off after the drive." Yates busied himself with the horses, suddenly aware of the unusual situation. "The house is this way." Inside, the cabin was simple but well-maintained. A large main room served as kitchen and living area with doors leading to 2 bedrooms. The furnishings were functional, a solid table with chairs, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with books that surprised his visitor. "You read much," she observed, scanning the titles. "Winter nights are long," Yates replied, stoking the fire against the sudden chill the storm had brought. "Make yourself comfortable." "Are you hungry?" The domesticity of the situation struck them both as peculiar, but the worsening storm outside rendered it necessary. They settled into an unexpected routine, Yates preparing a simple meal while Bright Path arranged her gathered plants on the table, separating and bundling them with practiced efficiency. "Your home is orderly," she commented. "Most white men living alone keep chaos around them." "I prefer things in their place," Yates said, setting plates on the table. "Makes life simpler." "Yet you have built space for more than one," she observed. "This house awaits a family." The observation, delivered without judgment, nonetheless touched a sensitive point. "It was the plan once," he admitted. "Plans change." They ate in companionable silence as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the valley. The storm had brought early darkness, and Yates lit lamps that cast a warm glow throughout the room. "You said once," Bright Path noted, returning to their interrupted conversation. "What changed these plans?" Yates considered deflecting but found himself answering honestly. "My family died of fever when I was 17. I learned that attachment makes loss unbearable." He focused on the fire rather than meet her eyes. "The frontier takes eventually, better not to give it targets." "So you build walls against connection, believing they protect you from pain." There was no pity in her voice, only recognition. "My people have lost much land, lives, freedom, yet we continue to love, to form families, to celebrate. Without connection, what remains worth fighting for?" The question lingered in the air between them, challenging the foundations of the life Yates had carefully constructed. Before he could formulate a response, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, and the distinct sound of breaking glass came from the bedroom. "The window in the spare room," Yates said, rising quickly. "A shutter must have broken loose." The bedroom was indeed flooding with rain through a broken pane, the curtains whipping in the wind. Together they secured the shutter and mopped the worst of the water, but not before Bright Path was thoroughly soaked. "You need dry clothes," Yates said, suddenly aware of her shivering. "I can find something." After some rummaging, he produced a clean shirt and trousers. "They'll be too large, but they're dry. You can change in here while I check the rest of the house for damage." When she emerged some time later, Yates had to suppress a smile. His clothes engulfed her smaller frame, the shirt sleeves rolled multiple times, the trousers cinched tight and still pooling around her feet. Yet somehow she maintained her dignity, her long black braids still neat despite everything. "The storm shows no sign of passing," he said, glancing outside where darkness had completely fallen. "You're welcome to stay the night. I can take the chair and you can have my room." "I will not displace you from your bed," she replied firmly. "The chair by the fire will suit me well." Their compromise was interrupted by a sudden pounding at the door that made them both freeze. Yates reached instinctively for his revolver, motioning for Bright Path to move away from the windows. Few visitors came during good weather, let alone in a raging storm after nightfall. "Yates, you in there? It's Matthew Baker." The voice, barely audible over the storm, belonged to a neighbor whose ranch lay several miles east. Keeping his gun ready but concealed, Yates opened the door to admit a drenched, wild-eyed Baker. "Thank God," Baker gasped, water streaming from his oilskin coat. "Raiders hit the Thompson place, burned the barn, stole horses." "Thompson's hurt bad, his wife too." "Apache?" Yates asked, acutely aware of Bright Path standing in the shadows. Baker shook his head. "White men masked, 6 or 7 of them, were gathering a posse." Every man needed. His eyes finally registered Bright Path, widening in shock. "What in God's name?" "A translator I hired to help with some Apache workers I'm considering," Yates lied smoothly. "Caught in the storm while we discussed terms." Baker's suspicious gaze lingered on Bright Path, clearly noting the oversized clothes and her unmistakable heritage, but urgency overrode curiosity. "Whatever your business, it'll wait. Thompson may be dying. We ride within the hour, storm or no storm." After extracting promises of Yates' participation and casting a final dubious look at Bright Path, Baker departed into the tempest. The momentary quiet that followed was heavy with unspoken concerns. "You should not have lied for me," Bright Path said finally. "It will bring you trouble." "The lie protects us both," Yates replied, already gathering gear for the night's grim work. "These raiders, they've struck before, 3 ranches in 2 months." "I know of them," she said, her expression grave. "They attacked 2 families from my band who were hunting in the lowlands last moon. They took care to dress as Apache during that raid, leaving signs for white authorities to find." Understanding dawned cold and clear. They're deliberately stoking tensions between settlers and Apache. "Just as peace talks are beginning," Bright Path confirmed. "There are those on both sides who profit from continued conflict." Yates buckled on his gun belt, mind racing through implications. "I have to go. Thompson has young children." He hesitated, then made a decision. "Stay here until morning. You'll be safe and the storm's too dangerous." "I will come with you," she stated, already searching for her dried clothes. "To a gathering of angry settlers looking for someone to blame." "It's too dangerous." "I know these raiders," she insisted. "I tracked them after they attacked my people. I can identify them by their horses, by the way they move. Without this knowledge, you may pursue shadows all night while the real criminals escape." Their gazes locked in silent contest, mutual concern warring with practical necessity. Finally, Yates nodded. "We'll need to be careful, stay close, speak little, and let me explain your presence." "I have navigated hostile territory before, Rancher Young," she reminded him with grim humor. Within 30 minutes, they were riding through diminishing rain toward the Thompson Ranch, where flames could still be seen illuminating the night sky despite the storm's efforts to douse them. Yates had insisted Bright Path wear his spare oilskin coat with the hood up, partially concealing her features in its shadow. To casual observation, she might pass for a young Mexican ranch hand, still unwelcome in some circles, but less likely to provoke immediate hostility than an Apache woman. The scene at the Thompson Ranch was chaos barely contained. The barn smoldered, reduced to charred timbers. Men worked bucket lines while others tended to wounded horses. Through open doors, Yates glimpsed Mrs. Thompson being tended on the kitchen table, her husband unconscious in the adjacent room. Sheriff Mills was organizing men into search parties when Yates and Bright Path arrived. His eyebrows rose at the sight of Yates' companion, but urgent matters superseded questions. "Raiders headed south by southwest," Mills informed the gathered men. "At least 6, maybe more. They've got Thompson's best horses and whatever they could grab from the house." "Any trail?" Yates asked. "Rain's washing it away fast," one of the trackers reported, "but they're moving toward Apache Pass." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Apache Pass was notorious, difficult terrain where ambushes had occurred throughout the recent conflicts. Bright Path nudged her horse closer to Yates, speaking low enough that only he could hear. They are not going to the pass, it is misdirection. The true route will be through Wolf Canyon to the west. It provides cover and water. How can you be sure? Yates whispered back. The pass is being watched by both Army and Apache scouts because of the peace talks. The raiders know this. Wolf Canyon is their only practical alternative if they wish to remain unseen. Yates weighed her certainty against the tracker's assumption. Deciding to trust her, he spoke up. Sheriff, we should consider they might cut west toward Wolf Canyon. The pass is likely watched these days. Mills considered this. Possible. Baker, take 5 men and head toward the pass. Yates, you and 3 others check the canyon approach. The rest spread out between. If you find them, fire 3 shots. Don't engage without support if possible. As they rode out, Baker cast suspicious glances toward Bright Path. Since when do you hire Mexican help, young? And why bring a hand on a posse ride? He knows this country better than most, Yates deflected. Tracks for me sometimes. Baker seemed unsatisfied but focused on the urgent task. Their small group pushed hard through the night, the rain finally ceasing as they approached the rugged entrance to Wolf Canyon. Bright Path rode slightly apart, Hood still concealing most of her features, observing far more than she revealed. 2 miles into the canyon, she subtly maneuvered her horse alongside Yates and murmured, fresh tracks ahead. 6 horses, heavily laden, moving fast. Yates squinted into the pre-dawn gloom, seeing nothing but rocky ground. You're certain? She gave him a look that needed no translation. Hold up, Yates called to the others. I think we've got sign. The other men dismounted to examine the ground, eventually finding what Bright Path had somehow detected from horseback, the faintest impressions of shod horses on the damp earth between rocks. Your boys got sharp eyes, one man commented, genuinely impressed. They proceeded with greater caution, following the increasingly clear trail as the canyon narrowed. Bright Path remained vigilant, occasionally steering them toward signs invisible to the others. Her woodcraft was extraordinary, born of necessity and generations of knowledge. The sky had lightened to pearl gray when she suddenly raised a hand in warning. Ahead, the canyon opened into a small box valley where 6 horses were picketed near a crude camp. Men moved around a small fire, silhouettes against the growing light. That's them, whispered one of the posse members. I recognize Thompson's bay stallion. We need to signal the others, Yates said, reaching for his revolver to fire the agreed-upon shots. Before he could act, Bright Path gripped his arm. Wait, something is wrong. Yates followed her gaze, trying to see what had triggered her concern. The raiders seemed at ease, almost casually confident despite knowing they would be pursued. It's too exposed, she explained, scanning the surrounding cliffs. They want to be found here. Understanding dawned coldly, an ambush. She nodded, pointing to the rocky ridges surrounding the valley. There will be others watching the entrance. We are expected. Their companions grew impatient. What's the delay? We need to move before they scatter. It's a trap, Yates said quietly. They're waiting for the full posse to arrive. Skepticism met his warning. How would you know that? Look at how they're positioned, Yates insisted. No sentries, fire burning bright, valuable horses in plain sight. They're bait. Doubt wavered across their faces, but years of frontier survival had taught these men to respect well-founded caution. One of them, a grizzled rancher named Cooper, nodded slowly. There's a game trail up the eastern ridge, he said. Steep but passable, might give us a view of any watchers. Leaving their horses secured, Yates and Cooper began the careful ascent while the others maintained watch. Bright Path followed silently, ignoring Yates' gesture to stay behind. Her movements over the rough terrain were so sure-footed and quiet that Cooper, glancing back, merely raised an eyebrow at her presence but offered no objection. From their elevated position, the trap became obvious. 3 armed men lay concealed among rocks overlooking the canyon entrance, the only apparent way in or out of the valley. They were positioned to cut down anyone entering to confront the visible group below. 9 altogether, Cooper whispered. Too many for us 4. If we wait for the others, we risk losing them, Yates countered, and more men riding in just makes a bigger target. Bright Path studied the layout with calculating eyes. There is another way, she said, her voice so soft they barely heard it. When both men turned to her in surprise, the first words she'd spoken in Cooper's presence, she continued, a path down from this ridge directly behind their camp. Used by my people for generations to hunt the valley. It is difficult but can be navigated by those who know the way. Cooper's expression registered shock at her clear, educated speech, then narrowed with suspicion. "You're Apache." "Yes," she answered simply, "and I know how to reach those men without being seen." A silent communication passed between the men, frontier pragmatism weighing immediate need against ingrained prejudice. Cooper spat quietly to the side. "Those bastards shot Thompson's wife while she was protecting her children," he said finally. "I don't much care who helps me make them pay for that." Their plan formed quickly. Bright Path would guide Yates and Cooper down the hidden path to approach the main camp from behind. The other two men would create a distraction at the canyon entrance, drawing attention from the ambushers without fully exposing themselves. The descent was treacherous, a near-vertical scramble down fissures and narrow ledges that had Yates questioning his sanity multiple times. Bright Path moved with the confidence of one following ancestral footsteps, occasionally pointing out hand and footholds invisible to untrained eyes. Dawn had fully broken by the time they positioned themselves behind the boulders at the edge of the raiders' camp. From this vantage, Yates could see their faces clearly and recognized several as drifters who had passed through Redemption Creek in recent months. Cooper readied his rifle while Yates checked his revolver. Bright Path, armed only with a knife, remained between them, eyes constantly scanning for movement. The agreed-upon signal came moments later, 3 short whistles mimicking a canyon wren, followed by shouts and a single gunshot from the canyon entrance. The raiders leapt to action, grabbing weapons and focusing on the perceived threat. "Now," Cooper whispered. They emerged from cover simultaneously, Yates and Cooper with weapons trained on the startled men. "Drop your guns," Yates commanded. "You're surrounded." 2 men complied immediately, clearly shocked by the attack from an unexpected direction. 3 others hesitated, assessing their options with the calculation of experienced gunmen. "Don't try it," Cooper warned. "Sheriff Mills and 15 men are right behind us." The standoff teetered on the edge of violence until the apparent leader, a hard-faced man with a distinctive scar across his jaw, slowly lowered his pistol. "This doesn't end here," he said, eyes cold as he stared at Yates. "We've got friends you don't know about." "Save it for the judge," Cooper replied. The 3 ambushers, hearing commotion, abandoned their posts and rushed into the valley, weapons ready. Seeing their companions captured, they skidded to a halt, caught in the open between threats from multiple directions as the rest of the posse finally arrived. The ride back to Redemption Creek with the captured raiders was tense but uneventful. Bright Path had withdrawn her hood upon being recognized, riding openly but remaining close to Yates. The other posse members gave her a wide berth, their gratitude for her assistance warring with ingrained suspicions. Sheriff Mills was more practical. After hearing the full account, he acknowledged her contribution directly. "Seems we owe you thanks, miss. Without your tracking, these men might have escaped." "Or worse, succeeded in their larger plan," Yates added, explaining their theory about the raiders deliberately inciting conflict between settlers and Apache. The theory gained credibility when documentation was found among the raiders' possessions, letters suggesting payment for services that would ensure settlement expansion once the Apache were provoked into actions justifying removal. The mastermind remained unnamed, referred to only as the benefactor. "I need to return to my people," Bright Path told Yates as evening approached. "My grandmother will be worried, and they must be warned about these men and their employer." "I'll ride with you part way," he offered, conscious of curious eyes watching their exchange outside the sheriff's office. They departed as the sun began its descent, following the same trail they had taken 2 days earlier, a mere 2 days that somehow felt like a lifetime ago. The comfortable silence between them now carried new weight, filled with unspoken questions about what would follow. "Your actions today will not be forgotten," Bright Path said as they approached the ridge that marked the edge of Yates' property. "My people will know of the rancher who values truth above convenience." "I didn't do it for recognition," Yates replied. "No," she agreed with a small smile. "You did it because your father taught you to judge by actions, not origins. And because something in you recognizes that walls against connection may keep pain out, but they also keep life out." Her insight struck uncomfortably close to truths he'd been avoiding since their first conversation. "Will I see you again?" he asked, the question escaping before he could consider its implications. "The juniper will need harvesting again when the moon is full," she answered, eyes holding his. "My grandmother's medicines require regular tending." The promise in her words carried him through the following weeks as he returned to the rhythms of ranch life. The raiders' capture had raised his standing in the community, though rumors about his Apache assistant generated speculation he steadfastly ignored. Something had shifted within him, a crack in the careful walls he'd maintained for years. When the full moon arrived, Yates found himself riding to the North Ridge without consciously deciding to do so. Bright Path appeared as naturally as sunrise, emerging from the juniper grove as if continuation rather than coincidence had brought them together again. Their meetings became a quiet ritual over the changing seasons, sometimes at the ridge, occasionally at his ranch when weather demanded shelter. She brought knowledge of plants and seasons. He shared books and discussions about a wider world. Each encounter expanded the connection between them, tentative but growing stronger with every shared conversation and comfortable silence. Autumn painted the landscape in amber and gold when their careful friendship confronted its first serious challenge. Yates rode into Redemption Creek for supplies to find the town buzzing with news. Major investors were arriving to survey for a railway spur that would connect to the main line 30 miles south. Biggest opportunity this territory's seen, enthused Thornton at the general store. Land values will triple once that track is laid. When's this happening? Yates asked, loading his purchases. Investors arrive next week. Railroad survey team the week after. Thornton lowered his voice conspiratorially. Word is they're eyeing the passage through Wolf Canyon as the most direct route. Eyes formed in Yates' stomach. Wolf Canyon cuts through traditional Apache hunting grounds. Thornton shrugged. Progress waits for no man, red or white. Besides, most of them are on the reservation now anyway. Except for those who weren't, Yates thought grimly, including Bright Path's band. Wolf Canyon provided critical access to water and game for the free Apache still living in the high country. A railway would destroy that resource and likely lead to discovery of the small band's location. He found Bright Path at their usual meeting place the following day, the joy of seeing her again tempered by the news he carried. Her face grew grave as he explained the situation. This threatens our very existence, she said when he finished. Without access to the canyon's water and hunting grounds, winter survival becomes nearly impossible. Maybe you could relocate to another area. Yates suggested, though he already knew the answer. The other mountain ranges are watched by the army or claimed by rival bands, she replied, and even if possible, my grandmother is too frail for such a journey now. The unspoken alternative, surrender to reservation life, hung between them. Yates had heard enough about conditions there to understand why Bright Path's people had risked everything to remain free. There must be another solution, he insisted. Perhaps, she said thoughtfully. If the investors could be convinced that Wolf Canyon is unsuitable for a railway. How? It's the most direct route by far. Direct is not always best. The canyon floods during spring melt and rock slides are common in the narrower sections. Her eyes took on a calculating look. Information that might concern investors worried about maintaining an expensive railway. Understanding dawned. We need to make sure they have complete information before deciding. Their plan took shape over the next 2 days, a careful campaign to educate rather than obstruct. Yates would approach the investors directly, offering his knowledge as a local rancher concerned about railway viability. Bright Path would gather evidence of the canyon's seasonal dangers, including markers of previous flood levels and documentation of rock slides. What neither anticipated was the identity of the lead investor, revealed when the stage arrived and disgorged its important passengers. William Harrington, a silver-haired man in an expensive Eastern suit, was none other than the benefactor mentioned in the raiders' letters, a fact Yates discovered when Sheriff Mills pulled him aside after introductions. Found more documents hidden in that raid leader's boot, Mills murmured, letters signed by Harrington himself authorizing payments for removing obstacles to progress. Be careful around him, young. He's got powerful friends in the territorial government. The revelation transformed their simple plan into something far more dangerous. Harrington wasn't just a businessman seeking profit, he was actively orchestrating violence to clear his path to wealth, including the attempted murder of the Thompsons. We need to expose him, Yates told Bright Path that evening at his ranch. The railway is just his latest scheme. He's behind the raids, probably other incidents blamed on Apache. Accusations without proof will accomplish nothing against such a man, she cautioned. We need evidence others cannot ignore. The letters the sheriff found are his word against a wealthy man's, she finished. Powerful white men rarely face consequences based solely on a sheriff's testimony, especially when profit for many hangs in the balance. Her assessment, though bitter, was accurate. Frontier justice often bent toward economic opportunity, particularly when indigenous interests stood opposed. Their opportunity came unexpectedly the following day. Yates, visiting town to observe the investors, overheard Harrington instructing his secretary to retrieve important documents from his hotel room and deliver them to a meeting with local businessmen. The financial projections and the other matter we discussed, Harrington emphasized. The special agreement documents, keep them secure until I call for them. Acting on instinct, Yates intercepted the young secretary outside the hotel, spinning a convincing story about Harrington sending him to help carry the materials to the meeting location. The secretary, overwhelmed by multiple tasks from his demanding employer, gratefully accepted assistance. Among the financial papers was a sealed envelope marked "Private Agreement" that Yates managed to quickly examine while the secretary was distracted greeting acquaintances. Its contents confirmed their worst suspicions. A contract with the territorial Indian agent offering substantial payment for assistance in relocating remaining free Apache to designated reservations through any means necessary once the railway construction began. Yates memorized key details before resealing the envelope, his mind racing with implications. This was the evidence they needed, but obtaining it legally would be nearly impossible given Harrington's position and influence. That evening, he shared what he'd discovered with Bright Path. The Indian agent has promised to declare an emergency removal order once railway construction is approved, he explained grimly. Harrington's paying him to use the army to force all remaining free Apache onto reservations, or worse. My people will fight rather than surrender, she said quietly. Many would die. Which might be exactly what Harrington wants, a final incident to justify complete removal. They sat in troubled silence before the fire, the magnitude of what they faced settling between them. More than the canyon, more than the railway, the very existence of Bright Path's people hung in the balance. There is one path, she said finally, but it requires trust between us beyond what we have yet shared. Her eyes met his, serious and searching. And it places you at risk as well. Tell me, he said simply. Her plan was audacious, a careful revelation of Harrington's schemes that would protect her people while exposing corruption that even profit-minded settlers would condemn. It required Yates to take public positions that might alienate neighbors, and Bright Path to risk exposure of her band's approximate location. We would be connecting our fates, she noted. Your standing among your people, my existence among mine, both would forever be altered. The implications extended beyond the immediate crisis, touching on possibilities neither had openly acknowledged in their months of careful friendship. Yates understood he was being asked to make a choice that would define his future in this territory. Looking at Bright Path in the firelight, her intelligence, courage, and dignity shining in every aspect of her being, he realized the choice had already been made, perhaps from the moment he'd intervened on a dusty street months earlier. Then let our fates be connected, he replied, reaching for her hand, whatever comes. The touch of their hands carried meaning beyond words, a bridge between worlds, a promise without conditions. When their eyes met again, the careful distance they had maintained dissolved into something profound and irrevocable. Their plan unfolded over the next 3 days with precision born of necessity. Yates approached Sheriff Mills privately, sharing what he'd learned and suggesting a legal means of obtaining evidence. Mills, whose frontier pragmatism extended to creative interpretations of search authority when justice required it, agreed to execute a warrant on Harrington's rooms based on the connection to the earlier raids. Simultaneously, Bright Path met with territorial representatives from neighboring Apache bands who had signed preliminary peace agreements. Armed with information about Harrington's true intentions, these representatives withdrew from scheduled meetings, citing concerning information about negotiation integrity. The synchronized actions created exactly the disruption they'd hoped for. Harrington, faced with both a legal search uncovering his private agreements and the collapse of carefully orchestrated negotiations, made a critical mistake. He attempted to flee with incriminating documents. His hasty departure was intercepted by Sheriff Mills and several deputies, including Yates in his capacity as a deputized posse member. The ensuing search of his luggage revealed not only the agreement with the Indian agent, but additional documents outlining a systematic plan to manufacture Apache hostility through disguised raids. The evidence proved sufficiently damning that even Harrington's powerful connections couldn't protect him. Territorial authorities, embarrassed by the potential scandal and the derailment of peace negotiations, moved swiftly to distance themselves. The railway survey was postponed indefinitely, with officials citing environmental concerns about the Wolf Canyon route, a face-saving measure that achieved exactly what Yates and Bright Path had sought. In the aftermath, as autumn deepened toward winter, they found themselves standing once again on the north ridge of Yates' property. The land stretched before them, golden grasses bending in the wind, distant mountains sharp against the clear sky. "Your people are safe for now," Yates said. "The new Indian agent seems genuinely committed to honoring territorial boundaries." "For now," she agreed, "though history suggests caution in such matters." She turned to face him fully. "My grandmother has asked to meet you. She says the man who would risk his standing for truth deserves proper recognition from our band." The invitation represented unprecedented trust, an acknowledgement of bonds that had grown far beyond their initial careful alliance. Yates understood its significance. No white man had been invited to their hidden encampment since the conflicts began. "I would be honored," he said simply. The journey took them deep into mountains Yates had viewed but never entered, following game trails and ancient paths visible only to those taught to see them. Bright Path moved with the confidence of returning home, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories associated with particular features of the land. The Apache encampment was smaller than Yates had imagined, perhaps 20 people living in traditional wickiups arranged in a protected canyon with reliable water and good defensive visibility. Their arrival generated cautious curiosity, children watching wide-eyed from behind their mothers, men assessing the stranger with reserved judgment. Bright Path's grandmother waited at the central fire, a tiny, wizened woman whose physical fragility contrasted sharply with the commanding presence she projected. Her face mapped a lifetime of experience in its deep lines, her eyes missing nothing as she evaluated the white man her granddaughter had brought into their sanctuary. "Grandmother," Bright Path said in Apache, then switched to English for Yates' benefit. "This is Yates Young, the rancher I have told you about." The old woman studied him silently, before speaking in accented but clear English. "So you are the one who sees with unclouded eyes, rare among your kind." "I try to see truth," Yates replied carefully, "though I often fail." A smile flickered across her weathered face. Honesty. "Also rare," she gestured for him to sit across the fire from her. "My granddaughter says you have risked much to prevent harm to our people. Why would a white rancher concern himself with Apache welfare?" The direct question deserved an honest answer. Yates felt Bright Path's eyes on him as he considered his response. "I was taught that justice matters more than convenience," he said finally, "and I've learned that walls built against pain also keep out everything worth living for." The old woman's gaze sharpened, looking beyond his words to their meaning. "You speak of connection, of bonds that cross the boundaries others have drawn." "Yes." She nodded slowly, then spoke to Bright Path in Apache. Their conversation continued for several minutes, Bright Path's responses becoming increasingly animated while her grandmother maintained serene composure. Finally, the old woman turned back to Yates. "My granddaughter believes our peoples can find a way forward together, that bridges can be built where walls once stood." Her eyes, despite their age, burned with intensity. "Such bridges require foundations of great strength to withstand the storms that will come." "I understand," Yates replied, though he wasn't entirely certain he did. "Do you?" she challenged gently. Bright Path carries our future in her hands. She walks between worlds in ways few can. The path she chooses affects not just herself but our people's survival." The implication became clear. The grandmother was addressing not just their alliance but the deepening personal connection between Yates and Bright Path, a bond evident to her observant eyes. "I would never ask her to abandon her people or her heritage," Yates said firmly. "Any path forward would honor both." The old woman studied him a moment longer before nodding once. "We will see what foundations can be built." She turned to include Bright Path in her gaze. "Time will test intentions against reality." The conversation shifted to practical matters, agreements about hunting access, mutual warning systems for dangers, medical knowledge exchange. By the time Yates departed that evening, preliminary understandings had been reached that would allow both communities to coexist with greater security. Bright Path accompanied him back to the boundary of his property, their journey largely silent as both processed the significance of the day's events. At the ridge that had become their regular meeting place, they paused as the setting sun painted the landscape in copper and gold. "Your grandmother is formidable," Yates observed, breaking their companionable silence. "She has survived much," Bright Path replied. She was already an elder when the first major conflicts with white settlers began. She has seen promises made and broken, peace achieved and shattered. Yet she's willing to try again. Because she sees what I see, that the future requires new approaches. Bright Path turned to face him directly. My grandmother spoke of foundations and bridges. She was asking about your intentions toward me. The directness was characteristic of her, but it still caught Yates off guard. The feelings that had grown between them over months of shared challenges and quiet conversations remained largely unspoken, constrained by the complex realities they navigated. My intentions, he began, then paused, searching for words that would honor the depth of what had developed. When we met, I believed the frontier left no room for genuine connection, that caring deeply only created vulnerability that would eventually bring pain. And now, her eyes held his unflinching. Now I understand that life without connection isn't safety, it's merely existence. He took her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. My intention is to build something that honors both our worlds, if you believe that's possible. It will not be easy, she cautioned. There will be resistance from both sides. My people fear assimilation that erases identity. Your people fear difference that challenges their assumptions. Then we create something new, Yates said with growing conviction. Not erasure, not surrender, but a shared path that respects both. The practical form of such a vision remained undefined, the challenges substantial. Yet standing there with the land stretching around them, something seemed possible that Yates would have dismissed as fantasy months earlier. Winter descended on the territory with unusual gentleness that year, cold but not bitter, snow sufficient to nourish the earth without burying it. The season brought changes to their relationship, deepening it through shared challenges and quiet moments. Bright Path continued as liaison between her band and the settlers, her role formalized through Sheriff Mills's pragmatic decision to appoint her as official translator for territorial matters. The position provided legitimate reason for her regular presence in Redemption Creek, gradually normalizing interaction that would have been unthinkable the previous year. Yates expanded his ranch operations, hiring 2 Apache men from Bright Path's band for the winter cattle management, an arrangement that raised eyebrows but proved so successful that neighboring ranchers cautiously began considering similar partnerships. Their personal relationship evolved with deliberate care, respecting both cultural traditions. When spring finally softened the landscape, Yates made the journey to the Apache encampment once more, this time with a formal purpose that had been discussed with both Bright Path and her grandmother through the winter months. The ceremony that joined them combined elements from both traditions, Apache prayers and rituals alongside promises Yates had grown up hearing in frontier churches. Bright Path wore a dress of traditional design created specifically for the occasion, adorned with beadwork that told the story of their unlikely meeting and alliance. Yates wore his finest clothes, augmented by a vest Bright Path had crafted incorporating both Apache and settler design elements. The small gathering included her entire band and a carefully selected few from Redemption Creek, Sheriff Mills, the Thompsons now recovered from their injuries, and Cooper, whose gruff exterior had gradually given way to genuine respect for the couple. "Never thought I'd see the day," Cooper remarked during the celebration that followed. "A white rancher and an Apache woman, building something together instead of tearing each other apart." "The way forward isn't about forgetting the past," Yates replied, watching Bright Path as she spoke with her grandmother across the fire. "It's about choosing not to be imprisoned by it." Their union became something of a local legend over the years that followed, the rancher and the medicine woman who created a place where both worlds could meet in respectful coexistence. The young ranch expanded its operations while maintaining access corridors for traditional Apache hunting and gathering. Bright Path's medical knowledge, combined with settler techniques, created healthcare approaches that served both communities. When children arrived, first a daughter with her mother's midnight eyes and her father's quiet determination, then twin sons who combined features from both parents in different measures. They grew up fluent in both languages, comfortable in both cultures, living embodiments of the bridge their parents had built. The challenges never fully disappeared. There were still those on both sides who viewed their union with suspicion or outright hostility. Territorial policies continued to pressure indigenous communities, and economic development regularly threatened traditional ways of life. Yet the foundation they had established proved resilient enough to weather these storms. On a spring evening much like the one when they had first met on the North Ridge, Yates and Bright Path Young stood watching their children play in the meadow beyond their expanded home. The ranch had prospered, now employing a mix of settlers and Apache in an arrangement that had gradually become accepted, if not fully embraced, by the surrounding community. "Do you ever regret the path we chose?" Yates asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders as they observed their daughter teaching her brothers to identify medicinal plants under the watchful eye of their great-grandmother. Bright Path considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "There are days when the weight of standing between worlds feels heavy," she admitted, "when I wonder if we ask too much of ourselves and now of our children." Yates nodded, understanding intimately the challenges they had navigated together. "But then," she continued, "I see what they are becoming, not divided between cultures but enriched by both. And I remember that young cowboy who believed love was a luxury the frontier wouldn't permit." "He was a fool," Yates said with a smile. "No," she corrected gently. "He was wounded by loss and trying to protect himself the only way he knew. Until he discovered that the walls that kept pain out also kept life out." She turned to face him fully. "You taught me that courage isn't just facing external dangers, sometimes it's risking your heart when everything suggests retreat." The setting sun bathed them in golden light as their children's laughter carried across the meadow, a sound that embodied everything they had built together against formidable odds. What had begun as a chance encounter between two wounded souls had transformed into something neither could have imagined alone. A family, a community, a future that honored both pasts while creating something entirely new. "No regrets," Bright Path said with certainty, leaning against his shoulder. "Only gratitude for the path that brought us here." As twilight deepened around them, Yates Young, once convinced that the frontier left no room for connection, held his family close and marveled at how completely one remarkable Apache woman had changed everything he thought he knew about love.